By relinquishing the blade, the field offered its quiet purpose to the sky. Now, stillness finds me in the dawn's first gold, rewarded for this lack of labor with the world's true currency, a cascade of life, a glittering, joyous music of seed and wing.
Part 1. The Governor's Hand. Chapter 1.1. The Edict of Tillage. The proclamation arrived not on a whisper of wind, but with the percussive beat of a horse's hooves on the packed earth road, a hard and urgent rhythm that silenced the meadowlarks. It came clutched in the gauntlet of a rider clad in the governor's gray livery, his face impassive, a stranger to the scent of turned soil and wild thyme. He did not speak to us, the people of the fields. He hammered the parchment to the old oak on the village green, the nail a single, brutal punctuation mark, and was gone before the splintered wood had ceased its trembling. The wind, when it returned, could not lift the silence. It only stirred the crisp edges of the paper, a sound like dry leaves skittering before a storm. We gathered, our shoulders stooped from habit, our eyes narrowed against the glare of the vellum. The governor's hand was there in the calligraphy, sharp, severe, and utterly divorced from the gentle curves of the land it claimed to rule. The wax seal was a blood-dark wound against the pale page. The Edict of Tillage. Let it be known by all subjects bound to the soil, the ink declared, each word a black tooth, that in this season of renewal no field shall lie fallow, no acre shall be given to thistle or to reed. The old ways of rest and recovery are hereby deemed an indulgence against the greater good. The text went on, a litany of iron words. It spoke of quotas and yields, of structured planting and mandated harvests. It was a command to scar the earth, to drive the plowshare deep and relentlessly, to extract a tithe of grain and root that bore no relation to the quiet communion between sun and seed. It was a war declared on stillness, a mandate to bleed the soil for its fealty to a distant, stone-walled authority. I felt the edict settle not in my mind, but in my bones, a cold weight that echoed the phantom ache of the plow handles in my palms. Around me the murmurs began, a low hum of anxiety, of resignation. Men spoke of sharpening blades, of mending harnesses. Their gazes turned to their own plots of land, but they no longer saw the dance of light on wild grasses or the promise of a patient dawn. They saw a debtor's ledger, a taskmaster's demand. I looked past their bowed heads toward my own field. It lay breathing under the afternoon sun, a tapestry of clover and errant poppies, a haven for the finches that feasted on last year's forgotten seeds. The governor's hand, a shadow I had never seen, now fell long and cold across that sun-warmed life, demanding I raise my hand against it. The edict was not parchment and ink, it was the steel of the coulter poised to tear open the heart of the world.
Chapter 1.2. The Governor's Hand. They came a week after the proclamation, a slow tide of gray-clad men seeping into the valley's green basin. They were not soldiers, for they carried no blades, but their presence was an invasion all the same. These were the scriveners and surveyors, the governor's tangible will, men whose eyes saw the world not as a living whole, but as a series of figures to be measured and recorded. The men of measure. The surveyors moved with a chilling precision. They unspooled their heavy iron chains, the links whispering a cold metallic song against the soft earth, a sound that snagged in the throat of the morning. They drove iron stakes into the soil I had so carefully nurtured back to fallow grace, each hammer blow a dull punctuation mark, in a sentence I did not wish to read. They squinted through brass instruments, charting the sun's arc not for its beauty, but to draw lines of ownership and obligation across the face of the land. My fields, which had only known the gentle geometry of plow furrow and seed scatter, were now being quartered and gridded, their wild, breathing spirit pinned beneath a rigid, invisible net. They spoke in a language of rods and parches, their voices flat and devoid of the land's soft dialect. The men of ink. Following in their wake, the scriveners set up their portable desks on the edge of the very field I had relinquished. They were pallid men, their fingers permanently stained a bruised purple from their inkpots. With the scratch and skitter of a crow's foot, their quills translated the surveyor's cold numbers into law. They rendered the slope of a hill, the curve of a stream, the sigh of the wind through the tall grass, into a series of lifeless symbols on brittle parchment. They were alchemists in reverse, turning the gold of the living world into the lead of a leader. The sweet scent of clover and damp earth was overpowered by the sharp chemical tang of their ink, a blight upon the air itself. I watched them from the shade of the old oak, my hands, for the first time in years, feeling utterly useless. I had laid down the scythe, believing I had made a pact with the land, a quiet understanding between my stillness and its life. But the governor's hand reached further than I knew. It did not need a blade to cut. It used ink to bind and chains to cate. The world's true currency, the one I had just begun to comprehend, was being devalued before my eyes, exchanged for the sterile script of a distant authority.
Chapter 1.3. The Cost of Stillness. The Cost of Stillness. They measured my peace in lengths of iron chain. The gray men moved through the waist-high clover and wild timothy, their progress a methodical crushing of stems. Their chain slithered behind them, a cold metal serpent dragging through the blossoms, catching on milkweed pods and startling clouds of copper-winged butterflies. It made a sound like a dull, rhythmic sigh, an exhalation of pure utility that cared nothing for the life it disturbed. One of them, the leader by the crispness of his tunic and the weight of the leather-bound ledger in his hand, approached me where I stood at the edge of the field, by the old stone wall. He did not look at the hawks circling in the vast, open blue above us, nor at the intricate tapestry of insect life at his feet. His eyes saw only lines, acreage, and potential yield. "Your parcel," he began, his voice devoid of inflection, a tool sharpened for a single purpose. He tapped a page in his book with a clean, trimmed fingernail. "It is registered as arable land, prime soil." "It is," I agreed. "It is resting. It is breathing." He offered a blink of incomprehension, a momentary pause in his calculations. "The edict of tillage is clear. Land that can produce for the good of the state must produce. Your field, it lies dormant. It is a debt against the governor's ledger." I wanted to tell him about the currency I dealt in. I wanted to show him the deep roots of the chicory strengthening the soil, to have him listen to the polyphonic drone of the bees in the vetch, and understand the wealth in the flash of a goldfinch's wing. But his language was only of columns and coin. "This stillness," I said, my voice softer than I intended, "it has its own purpose." "Purpose is measured in bushels and tacks," he corrected, his patience wearing thin. He turned a page. "The levy has been assessed for failure to till, for the deficit of grain, for the cost of your stillness." He named a figure, a weight of silver so alien to this place that it felt like a curse. It will be collected before the first frost, or the land will be given to a hand that knows the value of a blade. He turned and followed his men, their gray forms receding into the vibrant green and gold. They left behind a single wooden stake driven into the heart of the field. Nailed to it was a notice, a pale rectangle of processed wood pulp that screamed its barrenness against the riot of life surrounding it. I stood there for a long time, until the sun warmed the dew from the spiderwebs. The silence returned, but it was altered. The joyous music of seed and wing played on, but now, beneath it, I could hear a new sound, the cold, quiet ticking of a debt coming due. The world's true currency was being called for conversion, and I had nothing to offer but the life they could not see.
Chapter 1.4 A Harvest of Dust. The plows came at noon. They were not the graceful wooden things of my grandfather's time, sung into the earth with a prayer. These were iron, heavy and brutal, dragged by sullen, sweat-slick oxen and steered by men whose faces were grim masks of duty. They were the governor's answer to my fine, a punishment for the wealth of stillness I had cultivated. I stood at the edge of my world, a ghost in my own garden, and watched them prepare to unmake it. The first blade bit into the soil with a sound like a scream. It tore through the matted roots of clover and wild rye, a raw, ripping violence that shuddered up through the soles of my feet. A wave of black earth peeled back, exposing the pale, tender flesh of the world beneath. It was a wound, long and deep, and from it spilled not blood, but the panicked life I had sheltered. A flurry of sparrows, their nests shattered, exploded into the sky like a handful of thrown gravel. Field mice, sleek and terrified, scattered from their hidden thoroughfares, suddenly naked to the circling hawk. The deep, contented hum of the bees vanished, replaced by the grating shriek of iron on stone and the flat, joyless shouts of the plowmen. They worked with a grim efficiency, carving relentless geometrical lines into the soft chaos of the meadow. Each furrow was another verse in a litany of desecration. They were not planting, they were erasing. They were turning a page of vibrant, living poetry into a blank, sterile slate. I saw the delicate architecture of a ground wasp's nest collapse into ruin, the deep taproot of a milkweed monarch nursery severed and left to wither on the upturned clod. All my lack of labor, all my patient watching, was undone in a single dust-choked afternoon. When they were finished, they left without a word. The oxen steamed in the cooling air, their great, liquid eyes full of a sorrow that matched my own. The men simply wiped the grime from their hands and marched away, their purpose fulfilled. I was left with their creation. The field, once a tapestry of green and gold, was now a monochrome scar of raw earth. The air, which had carried the scent of nectar and damp soil, was thick with a fine, gritty powder that coated my tongue and stung my eyes. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in hues of apology, a breeze stirred. It did not carry the music of seed and wing. It lifted the finest topsoil, the very life of the land, and swirled it into a choking brown cloud. This was the governor's yield. This was my new inheritance, a harvest of dust.
Part 2. The Broken Scythe. Chapter 2.1 The Iron Furrow. The Iron Furrow. The plow did not ask permission. Its iron point, a gloss of malevolent black in the morning sun, met the skin of the field with a sound I felt in my teeth, a high, grinding shriek. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that was never meant to be opened, the grating of a bone improperly set. The earth, which had for so long held its breath in a quiet exhalation of clover and Queen Anne's lace, was ripped open in a gasp of black soil. I stood at the edge, a statue of impotence.
My hands, which knew the gentle curve of a scythe and the weight of a seed basket, were clenched into useless fists. The beast of iron and steam belched a foul smoke that hazed the clean gold of the dawn. Moving with a rhythm that was not of muscle or sinew, but of piston and fire, it carved a single, unwavering line, a brutalist's geometry imposed upon the soft chaos of life. With each turn of the wheel, a universe died. I saw the fibrous weave of milkweed roots torn from their deep anchorage, their white blood beating on the shredded stems. I saw the intricate city of ants and beetles, a civilization of chitin and purpose, overturned and buried in a single, indifferent motion. I watched as the plowshare unearthed the delicate, cup-shaped nest of a field sparrow, tossing its pale, speckled eggs into the churning wake like discarded pebbles. The frantic cries of the parent birds were swallowed by the engine's drone. The air grew thick with a new smell. It was not the sweet, fecund scent of loam I remembered from my grandfather's time, the promise of germination and growth. This was the smell of a wound, an acrid, metallic tang mixed with the scent of crushed chlorophyll and damp, subterranean things exposed to a sun they were never meant to feel. The iron furrow was a scar, a dark, weeping gash that stretched from one end of my piece to the other. It was straight, perfect, and utterly dead. The machine plowed on, back and forth, laying down a grid of black wounds over the breathing green. It was erasing the field's quiet purpose, writing a new text of servitude in a language of violence. The joyous music was gone, replaced by the metronome of the engine. The cascade of life had become a torrent of soil, a harvest of dust and death. The sky, once a partner in this place, now seemed a vacant, distant observer to the violation below.
Chapter 2.2 The Snapping of the Tang. I had retreated inside, but the house offered no sanctuary. The walls, built of river stone and timber from the high woods, had always hummed with the valley's quiet life, the drone of bees in the eaves, the whisper of wind through the flue. Now they only served to amplify the iron furrow's grinding song. The vibration traveled from the wounded earth up through the stone foundations and into the soles of my feet. It was a constant low tremor, a dissonance that settled in my teeth and rattled the marrow in my bones. I closed my eyes, trying to find the memory of silence, but the shriek of the plowshare was relentless. It was the sound of a thing that knew only how to take, a sound devoid of prayer or patience. It reminded me of my grandfather's old scythe, the one I had laid to rest in the back of the shed. I thought of its blade, honed to a silver whisper, and the long, elegant curve of its snath. But most of all, I thought of the tang, the unseen spike of steel that whetted blade to handle, the hidden heart of the tool. It was a connection of purpose, a bridge between the hand that guided and the edge that sang through the grass. The grinding outside pitched higher, a sudden metallic scream as the plow's point struck a deep and stubborn stone, one of the valley's ancient ribs. The engine groaned in protest, a belch of black smoke staining the sky. Then came a sound that was not a grind or a shriek, but a sharp percussive crack. It was absolute, a sound that split the air and left a ringing void in its wake. In that same instant, a tremor shot through me, a violent internal lurch. It was not in my bones, but deeper, in the place where peace had taken root. I felt a clean, sickening fracture, as if a vital, unseen connection within me had been put to a tension it could not bear. It was the snapping of the tang,
The bond between the stillness I had cultivated and the world that had rewarded it was severed. The engine noise resumed its drone, but the change was irrevocable. The sound no longer felt like an assault from the outside. It was now a part of the hollow space inside me. The wound in the field had its echo in my own spirit. A raw and ragged edge where something essential had been torn away. The quiet purpose I had found was gone, replaced by the ringing silence of a profound and irreparable break.
Chapter 2.3 The Unmaking. I stood with the two halves of my life in my hands. The snath, its familiar ashwood splintered and pale, felt like a broken bone. The blade, still holding the ghost of a curve, lay cold and inert on the floorboards, its keen edge a useless memory. It was not the governor's men who had broken it. Not directly. It was the house itself, shuddering with the agony of the earth that had passed the sentence. The scythe, my scythe, had died of a sympathetic wound. A morbid gravity pulled me to the door, the same force that makes one touch the edge of a fresh injury. The sound was a physical thing, a grinding roar that vibrated in my teeth and settled deep in my gut. It was the sound of a world being turned inside out. The black gash in the field widened with every pass of the machine, a spreading stain of dark, violated soil. This wasn't tillage, it was anatomy, a dissection. The skin of clover and vetch was flayed back to reveal the pale flesh of the subsoil. The intricate vasculature of worm tunnels and root paths was severed. The delicate lattice work of 1,000 years of mycelial conversation was shredded in an instant. I smelled it then, not the sweet, fecund promise of spring planting, but the sharp, raw odor of torn things. I imagined the chorus of life that had thrived there, the slow, patient work of the beetle, the frantic pulse of the shrew, the silent and vital breath of the fungi, all of it silenced, suffocated under the weight of the iron. A cloud of displaced finches and sparrows wheeled in confusion above the chaos, their calls thin and panicked against the engine's drone. They were refugees, their homes, their larders, their very world being erased beneath them. With every furrow, something in me was also plowed under. The man who knew the language of the wind in the timothy grass, the man who could read the coming rain in the curl of a clover leaf, the man who had relinquished one kind of labor for a deeper, more quiet kind of listening. That man was being unmade. The stillness I had cultivated, the peace I had found in the absence of the blade, was being systematically dismantled by a blade of a different, brutal order. I retreated from the doorway, leaving the monstrous surgery to continue. I knelt and picked up the two pieces of the scythe. I held them together, trying to feel the memory of their wholeness, but the break was clean and absolute. Outside, the engine droned on, the tireless, methodical sound of erasure. The field was becoming a blank page, its poetry of seed and wing violently deleted. And I, its reader, was left with nothing but the broken spine of a book I could no longer open. Chapter 2.4 A Seed in the Dust. The dust settled. It coated the sills of the windows, the leaves of the stoic oak at the field's edge, the splintered handle of the scythe I still held. The silence the plows left behind was not peace. It was the hollow ring of a desecrated place, the sound of a lung that could no longer draw breath. The air, thick with the ghosts of clover and crushed timothy, tasted of grit and cold iron. That evening, I walked out into it. My boots sank into the powder, the soil's fine-milled agony. Where there had been a resilient green skin, a tapestry of root and leaf, There was now only a uniform, lifeless gray. The furrows were not gentle curves inviting seed, but gashes, brutal and straight, ruled across the land like lines in a ledger of ruin. It was a landscape of pure geometry, the governor's geometry, and it had no soul. My hand went to my pocket, a familiar, unconscious gesture. It was a habit from the days of walking the meadow, my fingers often finding a smooth river stone, a fallen feather, or the peepery husk of a milkweed pod. This time, they closed around something else. A single hard kernel I'd forgotten was there. A sunflower seed, plucked weeks ago from a drooping, heavy head, a remnant of the field's own glorious, chaotic abundance. It was small and unassuming, a tear-shaped speck of potential. In the vast emptiness of the field, under a sky bleeding from violet to ink, the smallness of it was absurd. What was one seed against an edict, against the crushing weight of iron and law? A fool's gesture, a prayer whispered into a hurricane. And yet, I knelt. The dust puffed up around my knees, a cold, sterile cloud. I looked not for the rigid line of a furrow, but for a place that felt like a wound, a spot where the earth seemed most broken. With my finger, I pushed aside the dust and the loose clods of dirt. The soil beneath was cool, still holding a memory of moisture, of life. I pressed the seed into this small hollow, a deliberate act of burial. Not an internment, but a planting. A secret. I covered it over, smoothing the dust with my palm, leaving no trace. There was no water to give it, no promise of sun uninterrupted by the shadow of returning plows. It was a treason of hope, a tiny, indefensible claim staked in the heart of the governor's new order. My first act of rebellion was not a shout against the sky, but a whisper into the dirt, a covenant made with a single seed in the dark. Part 3, The Fallow Heart. Chapter 3.1, The Empty Hand. The empty hand. My hands have forgotten their purpose. They lie open in my lap, palms up, like cupped beggars or discarded tools. The calluses, once proud maps of a life's labor, now feel like useless, hardened scars. The skin at the base of my thumb, thickened from the pressure of the snathe, aches with a phantom memory. I find myself clenching them into fists and then uncurling them slowly, as if the motion itself might conjure the familiar weight of worn ashwood. But they close on nothing. They hold only air, a cool and substanceless draft where the heft of my life used to be. For days, this has been my ritual. I do not go out, the door remains shut against the sight of the wound, but the wound is inside me as well. The house, once a partner in the rhythm of my days, has become a stone tomb. The morning light slants through the window, no longer a summons but an accusation. It illuminates the dust motes dancing in the stillness, each a tiny glittering reminder of the pulverized earth that was once my field. My body is a liar. It wakes before the dawn, muscles tensing for the long, sweeping arc of the blade. My shoulders anticipate the pull, my hips the pivot. It is a dance ingrained in my very marrow, a language spoken between muscle and sinew, earth and steel. Now, the dance has no partner. The impulse rises, a ghost of motion, and finds no release. It is a silent scream trapped in the cage of my ribs, a tension that settles into a profound and hollow weariness. This lack of labor is not a rest. It is an amputation. I look at my hands again. They are strong hands, shaped by a lifetime of holding, guiding, and cutting. They knew the language of the seasons, the heft of a stone, the delicate severing of a stalk of wheat. Now they are mute. They are empty.
and in their emptiness, I feel the full measure of my own. The field was my body, and the scythe was my will. Both are broken, and my heart, lying fallow in the quiet ruin, has no reason to beat. Chapter 3.2 The Green Scar. For weeks, the field was a body laid open. The sun baked the raw earth into a cracked and gaping wound. The furrows, carved by the governor's plows, were not gentle valleys promising growth, but long, livid gashes that refused to close. A fine, sterile dust, the powdered memory of clover and Queen Anne's lace, coated everything. The air, once thick with the hum of bees and the rustle of seed heads, was a hollow vessel. Silence was the only crop the iron had managed to sow. Then the rain came. It was not a soft, nurturing shower, but a slow gray weeping from the sky that lasted for 2 days. It fell with a sound like 1,000 soft fingertips tapping on a drumskin of parched earth. It turned the dust to a thick, dark slurry, washing the grime from the stoic leaves of the oak at the field's edge and seeping into the soil's deeper flesh. The furrows drank and softened, the hard edges of their violence blurring into runnels of mud. The land lay still, saturated and dark, as if in a deep, healing sleep. I avoided looking at it. The sight of that raw, sutured earth was a mirror to the barrenness in my own chest. But a week after the rain, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, or the memory of it, drew me to the window. It was not a memory. There, tracing the precise, brutal line of the deepest furrow, was a seam of impossible green. It was not the gentle green of the old meadow, but a sharp, acidic hue, the color of life fighting its way through a tomb. It wasn't a carpet of new grass, but a thin, defiant thread, a single stitched line of nameless weeds and pioneer grasses. They had not sprung from the seeds I had known, but from something older, something that had waited in the dark for its moment of disturbance. This was not a rebirth. It was a scar. The green followed the path of the wound, a vivid testament to the violence that had been done. It did not erase the injury, it defined it, memorialized it. The field was not returning to what it was becoming something else, something that would forever carry the mark of the iron. The straight, unnatural line of new growth was a declaration: I am broken here, and here, and here, and I will live. I pressed a hand to my chest, over the hollow place where my own purpose used to be. The scar on the land did not offer comfort, not yet. It did not promise a return to the joyous music of before. But as I watched that fierce green stitch hold the earth together, I felt the phantom prick of something breaking through the fallow soil of my own heart. Chapter 3.3 Learning the Shape of Stillness. I used to measure my days by the arc of the scythe, my life by the cycle of harvest. Now time had become a different element, a slow, deep river in which I was suspended. Stillness was no longer a brief rest between labors, a gasp of breath before the next swing. It was the medium in which I lived. At first, it felt like a punishment, a hollowing out. The silence in the house was a judgment, but as the sun continued to rise and set upon the mauled earth, I began to learn the shape of this new quiet. It was not an absence, but a presence. It had a weight, like the cool air that pooled in the valley before dawn, and a texture as intricate as the lace of frost on a dead thistle. I began to wake not to the thought of work, but to the first hesitant notes of a sparrow testing its voice against the coming light. I would sit at the window, my hands lying useless in my lap, and watch the world assemble itself. The old rhythm of my life, the broad, sweeping gestures of sowing and reaping,
had been a kind of blindness. It was a life lived in the macro, a conversation with the whole field at once. This new life was a study in the miniature. I learned the specific, hovering dance of the damselfly, a fleck of living turquoise above the green scar. I learned the patient cartography of the ant, tracing invisible continents over the cracked clay. I learned the way the light fell through a single, resilient clover leaf, turning it into a pane of pale green glass. My focus, once thrown to the far edge of the field, now drew close. I could spend an hour watching a beetle, a tiny, iridescent jewel, navigate the treacherous terrain of a clod of earth. Its struggles, its persistence, its utter absorption in its own existence became a kind of scripture. The frantic thrumming in my own chest, the rage and grief that had echoed the violence of the plowing, began to quiet. It did not vanish, but it settled, finding a new, slower cadence. It was the pulse of the seed, dormant but alive. It was the rhythm of the root, seeking moisture in the dark. My fallow heart was learning the language of the fallow field. I was not idle, I was attentive. And in that attention, a new purpose began to germinate, as quiet and as tenacious as the first green shoot to break the iron-hard crust of the furrow.
Chapter 3.4 The Unplanted Harvest. The air has cooled. There is a crispness to the dawn that speaks of autumn, a language my bones have always understood as a call to the granary, to the whetstone, to the final, frantic gathering before the long sleep of winter. My muscles still twitch with the phantom memory of it, the ghost of 1,000 lifts, 1,000 swings. But the granary door remains shut, its hinges stiffening with rust. The scythe remains broken. The field, unplanted, has nothing for me to take. And yet it is a field of immense plenty. Where uniform stalks of wheat should have stood, a wild and intricate tapestry has woven itself. The governor's furrows are now mere suggestions beneath a riot of life. Plumes of goldenrod burn like slow torches in the afternoon light. The faded purple of thistleheads has burst, releasing clouds of silver down that drift on the breeze like a premature, weightless snow. Queen Anne's lace holds up its delicate, skeletal umbels, each one a dry cup full of tiny, aromatic seeds. The wind moving through the tall grasses is not the heavy rustle of grain, but a lighter, sharper whisper, a sibilant song of what grows for its own sake. This is a harvest not of my making, and I am not its harvester. I am merely a witness to the true reaping. The finches have come, whole chattering flocks of them, clinging to the thistle stalks, and meticulously, joyously picking them clean. They are a glittering, trembling crop of gold and black, their quick movements a dance of pure purpose. Sparrows descend on the wild rye, their wings a blur. I see the fat, deliberate drone of the last bumblebees of the season, plundering the last of the clover that has fought its way back to the light, their legs heavy with gold dust. In the evenings, I hear the rustle and skittering of mice and voles in the undergrowth, feasting on the fallen bounty, growing fat for the coming cold. I sit on my stoop, my hands empty in my lap, and I gather it all, not in baskets or sacks, but in the quiet chambers of my own fallow heart. I am harvesting the whir of wings, the brittle crackle of a seed pod in the sun, the sight of a spider's web strung between two stalks of timothy, its silk a net for the morning's golden light. This is the field's offering, its tithe to the sky, the wind, and the creatures that call it home. It is a currency that cannot be counted or taxed, a wealth that grows not from labor, but from its absence. It does not fill the belly, but it nourishes something deeper, something I was starving and did not even know it.
Part 4. An Unforeseen Harvest. Chapter 4.1 A Volunteer Crop. A volunteer crop. It began not as a single sprout, but as a change in the quality of the light. For months, the field had been a study in browns and grays, the scarred earth reflecting the sky with a dull, defeated apathy. But now, when the morning sun slanted across it, the land seemed to hold the light differently. It didn't just reflect, it absorbed, and from its depths a new color was breathing forth. A faint, almost imperceptible viridescence, like rust giving way to patina. I had grown accustomed to the emptiness, finding a strange peace in its barrenness. But this new life was a summons. I found myself walking out past the stoic oak, my boots sinking slightly into soil that was no longer baked hard, but had begun to soften, to yield. I was walking not on a wound, but on a mending scar. The governor's plows had turned the world over, burying the neat rows of my intention deep beneath the churned soil. They had meant to create a blank slate for their own designs, a page wiped clean for their iron script. But they had not accounted for the seed bank, the patient, waiting memory of the earth itself. What was rising was not a crop I had ever sown. This was a volunteer army, mustering in the furrows. A tapestry of survivors. There was the deep, tenacious green of wild clover, its roots stitching the loose soil together. The feathery stalks of timothy grass, which I had thought lost forever, now reappeared in defiant clumps. The uninvited. Among them were others, plants I had once named weeds and ruthlessly culled. Prickly thistle, with its promise of a lavender crown. The sprawling, cheerful faces of dandelions. Fireweed, its tall spire a magenta flame against the brown earth. And here and there, a slender stalk of rye, or a head of wild oat, ghosts of harvest past, seeds that had lain dormant for seasons, now finding their moment in the chaos. This was not a field of singular purpose. It was a riot, a boisterous, untidy congress of life, each plant pushing toward the sun according to its own nature. There were no straight lines, no clean divisions between one thing and another. It was a tangled, interwoven whole, a green and living refutation of the iron furrow. I knelt, my fingers tracing the leaf of a plantain, a healer of scraped knees and bee stings. I had not planted it. I had not watered it. I had done nothing but stand aside. And in my absence, the field had begun to sow itself. This was its own harvest, unforeseen and unbidden, rising from the dust of my undoing.
Chapter 4.2 The Chorus of Thistle and Finch. The silence of the field had been a hollow vessel. Now it was being filled. It started not with a single sound, but with a shift in texture, the air growing thick with a low, resonant hum. It was the vibration of 1,000 tiny wings, bees and hoverflies intoxicated by the clover, a soft, sonorous drone that laid a foundation for the music to come. Upon this foundation, the thistles built their cathedral. They had risen from the plow's iron scars not as weeds, but as architects of a new order. Each stalk was a spire, bristling and defiant, crowned with a burst of violet so deep it seemed to hold the last light of dusk. The wind, which had once carried only dust and the scent of broken earth, now moved through them with a dry, papery rustle, a percussive whisper that was the field's own quiet prayer. And then the finches came. They arrived not in a flock, but as a shower of gold, a living currency scattered upon the purple crowns. They were tiny, brilliant bursts of life, drawn by the promise of seed. I watched them, a species of finch I had scarcely noticed in my years of toil, their plumage the color of dandelions in summer sun. They clung to the prickly heads of the thistles, their weight bending the proud stalks, their sharp beaks performing a delicate surgery to extract the tufted seeds. Their song was the glinting top note of the chorus. It was not a lament, nor a simple declaration of territory. It was a chittering, joyous sound, a cascade of notes that seemed to tumble over one another in their eagerness. It was the sound of feasting, of abundance, of life so effervescent it could not be contained. It was the music of seed and wing, a glittering, unrestrained symphony played out on the instrument of the resurrected field. I stood at the edge, the broken scythe a distant memory. My hands, once shaped by the smooth ash of its handle, now hung empty at my sides. But they did not feel empty. They felt full of the vibrations that traveled from the soil up through the soles of my feet. I was no longer the conductor of this land, forcing my will upon it with a blade. I was merely a member of the audience, a silent witness to a performance that had been waiting all this time for my own silence. This chorus of thorn and down and golden wing was a harvest I had never known how to plant, and it was more bountiful than any I had ever reaped.
Chapter 4.3 The Currency of Dawn. I no longer wake to the sharp demand of a rooster's crow, but to a gentler summons, the gradual dilution of the dark. My body, still tuned to the old rhythms of labor, rises before the sun. But where I once would have reached for a tool, I now reach for the stillness, wrapping it around my shoulders like a familiar cloak. I sit on the porch steps, the worn wood cool beneath me, and I wait. The governor, in his gilded halls, deals in a currency of silver and stamped paper, a value extracted and quantified. I once dealt in a similar coin, the weight of grain in a sack, the heft of a root pulled from the soil. My wealth was measured by the ache in my back, by the calluses that mapped my palms. I traded sweat for sustenance, domination for yield. It was an honest but impoverished accounting. Now I witness a different transaction. It begins as a pale line of pewter at the world's far edge, a single pure note held in the throat of the sky. Then the gold arrives. It does not seep, it pours, a molten river that spills over the high ridge and floods the field. This is the first payment of the day, a fortune freely given. The light mints the world anew, and I am here to see it. This is the world's true currency, the one for which the governor has no ledger. A cascade of life. Each strand of a spider's web spun between the skeletal arms of a milkweed is suddenly a string of diamonds, catching the light in 1,000 tiny suns. A beetle, its carapace an iridescent jewel of emerald and bronze, climbs a blade of grass as if ascending a monument. A breath of wind sets 1,000 thistledown seeds adrift, a blizzard of future life, each a tiny, weightless coin tumbling through the air. This is not the singular, monolithic wealth of a wheat field. It is a wealth of infinite, intricate detail. A glittering, joyous music. The chorus I had begun to learn is now a symphony. The finches still offer their bright, metallic trills from the fence line, but they are only the melody. Beneath them, there is the hum of emergent bees, the dry rustle of seed heads nodding in the breeze, the whisper of swallows' wings as they slice the air. It is a music built not of notes, but of purpose, the sound of a world waking up to its own uncommanded labor. I was a man who believed his worth was in the breaking of things, of soil, of sweat, of silence. The governor's iron broke me in turn, and I thought myself ruined. But the field, in its quiet defiance, has taught me a different truth. By relinquishing the blade, I have been given the world.
The stillness I was forced to endure has become the price of admission to this priceless theater. Here, in the dawn's first gold, I am no longer a man of lack. I am a man made rich by his own undoing.
Chapter 4.4 A Trespass of Life. A trespass of life. It came in the blue hour before dawn, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the woods. A doe, her coat the color of winter bracken, stepped into the open field. She moved with a liquid grace that paid no heed to the ghost lines of the governor's furrows, still faintly visible beneath the new growth. She was not following a path. She was making one. Her presence felt like a violation, a beautiful, deliberate crime. She was the first, but not the last. The field, in its unplanted rebellion, had become a sanctuary for outlaws. I began to see their signs everywhere, a secret script written on the land. The trails of velvet. Narrow paths, no wider than my hand, began to weave through the stands of thistle and Queen Anne's lace. These were not the geometric certainties of the governor's surveyors, but the winding, intuitive roads of rabbits and field mice, mapped by hunger and haste. The ghost of the fox. At dusk, I would catch a flicker of rust-colored fire at the field's edge. A vixen, lean and sharp, would watch my house with an unnerving intelligence before melting back into the cooling air. Her nightly passage was a silent patrol, a claim staked in defiance of any human law. The Feast of Horns. The tender shoots of the volunteer clover were cropped low in perfect circles where deer had gathered in the night. They were harvesting what was never sown, dining on a crop that belonged to no one, and therefore to them. Each track, each nibbled leaf, each fleeting glimpse of fur was a trespass. The governor had demanded a cleared ledger, a barren slate awaiting his grand design. The field, however, had chosen to write its own story in a language of hoof and claw. This was not the ordered life of a tended farm. It was a cascade, an anarchic flood of vitality that seeped through the cracks of the edict. I was its keeper, the silent warden of this illegal Eden. My stillness, once a mark of my defeat, had become my complicity. By not raising a hand, by not driving them away, I was sheltering fugitives. A strange and thrilling fear took root in me. The Edict of Tillage had outlawed my work, but this wild resurgence felt like a far greater crime against the governor's sterile vision of progress. One evening, the vixen did not flee. She stood fully in the open, her paws neat on the scarred earth, and looked directly at me. In her amber eyes, I saw no fear, only a shared understanding. We were both trespassers here, living in the margins of a broken law, drawing sustenance from a world they had tried and failed to unmake. Her wildness called to my own, and for the first time since the plow had come, I felt not just peace, but a fierce and quiet joy.
Part 5. The Currency of Dawn. Chapter 5.1. A Tithe of Dew and Pollen. A tithe of dew and pollen. I began to walk the field's edge at that first moment of visibility, when the world is still more shadow than form. It was a pilgrimage of inches. Before, my eyes had been fixed on the horizon, measuring the sky for rain, judging the sun's progress as a taskmaster. Now my gaze had fallen to the earth, to the details I had trampled for a lifetime. The tithe was paid first in dew. It was not a simple dampening of the ground, but an act of intricate adornment. Every serrated edge of a thistle leaf, every filament of a dandelion clock, every forgotten clover was outlined in liquid silver. On the vast, intricate tapestries of spiderwebs strung between stalks of mullein, the dew collected like seed pearls, a fortune scattered with reckless generosity. Each drop was a lens, and to look into it was to see the dawn sky, vast and peach-colored, held in a space smaller than a mustard seed. This was the night's offering to the day, a silent, glittering transaction I was now privileged to witness. The governor's coin was hard, cold, and demanded labor. This currency was weightless, transient, and asked only for stillness. Then, as the sun's first true rays slanted across the land, warming the air, the second tithe was given. A fine golden dust began to rise from the million blooming heads of ragweed and aster. Pollen. It was a tangible haze, a Midas breath that coated my worn boots and settled on the hairs of my arms. It was the color of the dawn itself, a powder of pure potential. I would watch the bees, humming with a purpose far older than any edict, their legs packed with this precious gold. They were the merchants of this new economy, trafficking not in scarcity, but in abundance. Their flight paths the invisible trade routes of a kingdom I had never known existed. I would stand amidst it all, a silent observer in my own field. I brought nothing, offered nothing but my own quiet presence. I did not sow, nor did I reap. Yet I was richer than I had ever been. My hands, once calloused from the grasping of a tool, were now soft, open to receive this wealth. The world had always been paying this tithe, this shimmering tax of beauty. My only poverty had been my inability to see it, my blindness caused not by darkness, but by the blade.
Chapter 5.2 The Unminted Gold. The sun did not rise, it spilled. It was a slow, liquid alchemy that began at the far eastern ridge, transforming the gray pre-dawn canvas into something precious. This was the unminted gold, the raw wealth of the world before it is hammered into submission, stamped with an emperor's face, and given a false, finite value. It was a currency that could not be hoarded in a coffer or weighed on a scale. Its only measure was the beat of a watching heart. I stood at the edge of the field, a beggar made rich by the morning. The governor's coin was a dead thing, cold in the hand, a promise of bread or land that could be revoked. This gold was alive. It clung to every surface, revealing the intricate craft of the unseen. Each strand of a spider's web, strung between the skeletal arms of a milkweed pod, became a golden wire, beaded with diamonds of dew, a net not for capture, but for catching light. Pollen drifted from the heavy heads of ragweed and goldenrod, a fine, shimmering dust of pure treasure that settled on my boots and the sleeves of my shirt. I was gilded by the field's casual opulence. A flock of goldfinches descended upon the thistles, their small bodies like living ingots with beating hearts. They squabbled and fed, their bright flashes a staccato rhythm against the deeper, resonant gold of the rising sun. I had spent a lifetime chasing a different kind of gold, the gold of wheat in August, the gold of coin in my purse. I had worked my muscles to sinew and my hands to leather for a yield that could be counted, taxed, and stored. I thought that was wealth. How poor I was. I had been trading the infinite for the finite, the living for the inert. The surveyors had measured this land in chains of iron. The plow had scarred it for a harvest of dust. They saw only dirt, potential for grain, a number on a ledger. They were blind. They could not see this. My poverty, my forced stillness, was the key to the vault. By having nothing left to take, I was given everything to see. The light deepened, burnishing the tips of the wild rye and painting the bellies of the low-scudding clouds. It was a treasure that demanded nothing but witness. It asked for no toil, no sweat, no blade. It was a payment for the simple act of being, a silent transaction between the sky and the fallow earth, and I,
rewarded for my lack of labor, was its sole astonished beneficiary. Chapter 5.3 The Commerce of the Bunting. If the dawn was an unminted gold, then the buntings were the first coins struck from it. They arrived in a flutter, small and quick, not as marauders but as merchants dealing in the day's new light. An indigo bunting, the first I saw clearly, perched on the skeletal arm of a milkweed stalk. He was not merely blue, he was a splinter of fallen sky, a chip of lapis animated by a frantic, tiny heart. He was a living currency, and the overgrown field was his marketplace. I watched him conduct his business. His transactions were swift, his negotiations silent. He would drop from his perch to a thistlehead, now gone to a puff of silver floss. This was his counting house. With a deft turn of his head, he'd pluck a single perfect seed. There was no brute force, no tearing of the plant. It was a delicate extraction, a withdrawal from a willing bank. The thistle, having completed its life's work of creation, now offered its progeny freely. Its wealth was in its dispersal, a future it could not sow for itself. The exchange. The bunting, having taken the seed, did not simply fly away a thief. He paid. The price was a flash of impossible blue against the muted greens and browns of the field. It was the weightless pressure of his feet on the stalk, a momentary anchor in the breeze. And then, from a higher perch on the oak, he would pay again, this time in song, a bright, tumbling cascade of notes that fell upon the field like a blessing. It was a sound that stitched the air together, that declared the value of this fallow ground. The ledger. The governor's men had measured my land in chains and calculated its worth in bushels of grain that would never be. Theirs was an arithmetic of extraction, a ledger of debt. But the field kept its own books. The transaction I witnessed was one of pure profit for all involved. The thistle paid its seed to the bunting paid its song to the air, and the promise of a new thistle somewhere beyond the stone wall. The currency was life itself, and it was never depleted. It simply changed form, from seed to wing, from wing to song, from song to silence, and back to seed again. This was the commerce that thrived in the absence of my blade. It was a bustling, intricate economy that asked for no tilling, no furrowing, only stillness. I, who had once believed my sweat was the only true investment in this soil, now saw the truth. I was not the master of a deadened asset, but the silent witness to a thriving trade, a welcome citizen in a commonwealth of seed and wing.
Chapter 5.4 A Reckoning on the Wind. The wind has always been the great arbiter of this valley. It was the wind that scoured the governor's furrows, lifting the fine topsoil and carrying it away like a debtor's last coin. It was a dry, punishing breath that spoke of barrenness, an accomplice to the iron plow. But the wind, I have learned, holds no allegiance. It serves only the laws of dispersal and change. Today, it tells a different story. It moves not with the rasp of dust, but with a silken rustle through the dry-headed stalks of thistle and Queen Anne's lace. It is no longer stealing from the field, it is carrying its wealth abroad. I watch it lift the feathered seeds of the milkweed, tiny vessels of defiance setting sail on invisible currents. I see it tease the tufted parachutes from the thistle, a million tiny promises of insurgency. My field, the one condemned for its stillness, is now exporting its rebellion. These are not the heavy, compliant seeds of wheat or barley, destined for the governor's granaries. This is a different kind of tithe. This is the currency of resilience, the coinage of the untamed. Each seed that drifts over the stone walls and beyond the surveyor's lines is a testament to the governor's folly. He sought to create a single, sterile crop, a monoculture of obedience. In his failure, he cleared the way for 1,000 untamable volunteers. A single milkweed seed, a perfect, buoyant star of floss, drifts down and settles on my sleeve. It is weightless, a thing of air and light. I look at its dark, teardrop center, the germ of a future forest of flowers, a future feast for monarchs. This is the reckoning. It is not an invoice delivered by a gray-clad scrivener, nor a verdict hammered to a post. It is this, a silent, irrefutable accounting delivered on the wind. The governor measured wealth in bushels and acres, in lines drawn on parchment and the clink of iron on stone. He believed he could command the earth to yield to his ledger. But the true ledger is the wind, and its accounts are kept in pollen and seed. On its pages, the governor's edict is a debt that can never be repaid, a monument to a profound and costly ignorance. My fallow field, by its quiet refusal, has balanced the books. It has paid its debt, not in grain, but in a cascade of life, a fortune cast to the four corners of the sky.